Hey all, it's KR, King of D&D Homebrew, talking today about how you can come up with a village for your world in 1 minute. And obviously this isn't something you necessarily plan on. It's usually when the players go somewhere and you haven't prepared. This happened to me just this last week, the inspiration for this video. My players they wanted to go to this area, the Barren Hills, and talk to this Kurok the Avenger, this orc chieftain, to try to get him to ally with them against this larger force to the east. And they now have this sailing ship, as usual, it's a long story, but they wanted to sail to the coast from here. And they said to me, oh, can we stop in this village of Hull that I had on the map? I had placed it on the map, but never really filled it out from the beginning of the campaign. So I had to scramble. I literally had 1 minute in which I asked them things like, hey, who are you taking along on this trip? Are you doing anything else? What's your, spells that you're going to have? Be prepared for this or that. They were talking to one another about their plans, how they were going to negotiate, while I'm creating the village of Hull to make it both realistic and interesting and, give them some potential information about the Barren Hills where they were going. And I used some techniques that I, just sort of developed, having made hundreds, if not thousands of villages over the years in a D&D style campaign, where I thought about what a village is, right? And the first thing is the population. You see different things. Some say 500 to 2,500. I tend to go 100 to 1,000. But again, you can vary that. But if I use 100 to 1,000, I can just roll 1d10 and 300 people. Okay, so the village of Hull has 300 people. Next is, who are those people, right? Depending on your setting, what races you have. D&D, this is a 5e campaign. It says most of the humanoids there are humans, but again, it can be any race. You can have a sprinkling of them, and you just have that in your mind. And it's easy to just say it's all humans. Maybe some, because again, halflings, is it a halfling village? Is it holes in the ground? Is it a gnome village, like say in Hills or something? You make that decision. But here, the village of Hull was on the coast. So it was going to be, I just said humans, 300 people. You look at that population, half is going to be children, so you have 150 adults. So let's say 20% are, people that can help defend the city. So that gives you 30, men at arms with crude improvised weapons. Is the city fortified? Depends on where it is in relation to other settlements. Is it way out in the wilderness? This was fairly remote, but I had a crew, 300 people. So they built sort of a wooden fence around this town as best they could. It wasn't going to be necessarily difficult for forces to break through. And then, of course, the why of this village. Why did people settle here and form a city together? There's security in numbers with this fence. And usually it depends either in this kind of setting on resources. There's something there that people will gather together to extract or to farm or whatever, to sell or trade with other communities. Or it's a location. It's at the, let's say it's a way station if it's on the coast, that ships will sail a certain way, stop there, resupply, get fresh water, move on. That kind of thing. Out on a road somewhere, if it's a day's journey, people will stop and have an inn or something. I covered this in my thing on creating a hamlet. You can check that out. Oftentimes a way station is much smaller. If you think of like gas stations and stuff along interstates, there might be a little town there, but it's pretty small. So the village should have something more than just be a way station, although it can be if it's 100 people. And again, that location will determine what the structures look like. So if you're in a mountain setting, you can have stone structures, not a lot of trees necessarily. A stone is, it's cold in the winter, but, you can be very fortified. If you're in a desert, you might have, or a plain, mud houses, right? You take some water and put together adobe style houses. If you're in a forested area, you're going to have wooden houses. This is the village of Hull, was along a coast, but it's a temperate zone. I assume there were enough trees around there to have wooden structures. And in terms of resources, I decided, since it's on the coast, it's a fishing village. They gather their fish. Now, obviously, the thing about this is they have to be able to salt the fish or whatever in order to keep it preserved so that they can transport it. If it is a fishing village where they, move that to other people. So it's along the Barren Hills here. I said that they had access to some salt mines. nearby. So it kind of makes a combination resource, right? You don't have to do that. You can just say it's a fishing village and then say nothing more. Right. And most players are not going to ask, well, where do they sell this fish? How do they get it to they're not going to necessarily say that. I just kind of like to have that because salt mines have always been interesting to me. But you don't have to do that. You just say it's a fishing village. It's on the shore, 300 people. And then the other critical thing is who's in charge, right? Because when the players go there and they go into this small place, they're going to probably have contact with, the leadership. Unlike, say, some, giant city or something, even perhaps a town, it's not that many people, and they're the people in charge are going to want to see strangers have come. Let's see who they are. And I usually do one of three things. Either there's a single figure who rules sort of by fiat, and this can range from a dictatorship to a very benevolent large landowner who's the richest person in town. You can also have two factions of people. Two large landowners competing. This is very interesting if you know the movie Yojimbo or, other classic Westerns and things, the two families that are opposed to one another. Or you can have rulership by consensus. Consensus being they've elected a mayor, and I don't say democracy because, medieval world, who gets to vote? Who doesn't? It's probably a select group of people. They probably trade the leadership around, very insider world, but still it's a consensus in that the mayor represents the interests of everyone, has to talk to everyone before making any kind of decisions, whereas the ruler by fiat just makes a decision. And another aspect of this is what is their relationship to the outside world. So if you have a village that's at the end of a road that's 50 miles from a city or a town, they're going to be back and forth and people are in and out and whatever. Whereas if you have a remote village like I had for this fishing village of Hull, they're not going to have as much contact. And traveling, not only does it take time to go to another settlement, but it can be dangerous. Hence the fortifications. And you can also get some suspicion about outsiders and, we don't like the big city and all that kind of, and you could say stereotypes of rural areas if you want, but just things where people are remote. If you have it up in the mountains or in a desert, let's say it's an oasis, their resource would be the water for travelers if there are caravans that go across the desert. They might not be hostile to the outside world. They might be very curious. They might be very welcoming of anyone who comes to this remote oasis, in the middle of the burning desert. But you think about that, their relationship geographically to the outside world. And then you can, if you want to get into that, if you have a village comprised of Dragonborn who've created this village to sort of get away, if the Dragonborn are mistrusted, sometimes tieflings, races like those, people will have mistrust or feel like the need to isolate themselves. They're going to have an attitude when the players come to see them. So you can just create a chart for that. You can always do this stuff just off the top. I'm going to have a tiefling village that's at the edge of the mountains, and there's a mine there, and they mine some kind of mineral that's valuable. And it's all tieflings. They're all, related somehow or not. There's two families of tieflings, right? Again, competing against one another. Because the point is, as happened in my world, the players, they landed on shore. I said, no, the fishing boats can go there, but the boat they're on is a little large. They don't have docks. It's a 300-person village. It can't really facilitate a big sailing vessel like the players were moving in. So they went ashore on a smaller boat. And they went into this human village, 300 people. I had one person that ran this, and he was just the richest fisherman and his family, and they were the prominent citizens. They also provided money to keep the walls in order. They had a militia, a very crude one. Again, I said like 20 people. They had some people with swords and spears and this kind of thing, but again, very low level, right? And then when the players got to Hull, they were seeing the ship stopping, a boat coming in. There's all sorts of activity on shore. Strangers are coming. And again, they trade fish. They trade with them. They didn't recognize this vessel, didn't recognize the sails. The players had created this sort of camouflaged vessel. They were doing smuggling. So they were a little like, what's going on here? Everybody was on guard. It wasn't just no one was paying any attention. Another ship in, another ship out. It's a village. That's a small village. So this is big news to them. So everybody comes out of their houses, and the players come forward, and the main guy and perhaps his sons or something like that, I think I said, comes out with about 5 or 6 of his lieutenants, right? And they come down they have docks for their fishing vessels, but they're very small, to greet the visitors as they come up in their small boat. And they say, welcome. I did not. And again, you can just roll this. The nice thing about having to roll things, literally 1, 2, 3, they're hostile, 4, 5, 6, they're friendly, or, 1, 2, they're hostile, 3, 4, they're neutral, and 5, 6, they're friendly. However you do it, it gives you a basis for which to present these to the players, because you're thinking about what the players are going to see and how you're going to describe this after you've created your village. Literally in 1 minute, you're going to have to make up names for people and write them down. If you say Crocus is the leader of sounds like a frog guy or something, Bullywug, but Crocus is the leader, write that down, because Crocus is now that name. And if you use a gag name, if you say Jim, it's Jim, right? The players remember that. So Crocus and his lieutenants come down and say, what brings you to these parts to Hull? Right? And the players say, what do they see? A dock with some fishing vessels, clearly a fishing village. They look out past the docks and they can see wooden palisades or fence or whatever, and some houses, maybe 2-story, but mostly just 1-story houses. And then they see villagers sort of gathering behind the Crocus and his men, and of course little children running around, because as I said, in these medieval villages, half the people were children, and very shyly looking at them. And again, they don't look fearful. They're not all batten down the hatches. They don't seem to be acting strange. They're acting like normal people act, that the players are accustomed to. They're curious but wary, and they're not unfriendly. And then the players go and negotiate and say, oh, we're doing an expedition. That's our sailing vessel. We're going into the Barren Hills. Now, the minute I say the Barren Hills, what's the relationship of them with the Barren Hills? Because this place it's a site of these famous Orcan Wars in my world 30 years before. The orcs were really angry at these settlers that had come and taken a lot of their land, and they made a push to get rid of them. And then the peace treaty was the orcs could live in peace in their ancestral homelands, the Barren Hills. And being only 5 miles away from the beginning of the hills, the villagers of Hull may have some interactions with the orcs. They may have heard rumors from people that have come into town, because there have been adventurers that stop off here on their way into the hills, because it remains a place of mystery. There's rumors of ancient civilizations that once lived there, all that kind of stuff in a D&D setting. So I had to quickly decide, what do they know about the Barren Hills? And of course, the orcs on the other side of the continent, on the eastern side of the other side of the set of settlements and everything, kind of defined my world. The orcs were on the rampage, and they were rising up, and there was this rumors of this group called the Red Hand that was, vowing to get rid of the outsiders once and for all. So they might also have heard these rumors, which they hadn't. I read that they're remote, and they had not heard of these things yet. The players then chose to tell them about this, which was an interesting choice. So they didn't have that much to say. Then you make a choice right here at this moment. Again, this is a 1-minute village where, has there been anybody of interest that's gone through the village recently? A group of adventurers. Have they seen things flying up in the sky, giant beasts? Have they heard noises from off, sounds of a battle somewhere off in the hills? If it travels that far, that'd be quite a ways. But, anything unusual. But you can just say, no, they're, going along, and they're not that curious about what's going on in the outside world. They just get in their boats, they fish, they come in, and then there's a little trail that runs. Once they get enough with the salt, they take it into a larger town to sell their wares and get goods. And whether they have, this fishing village with 300 people probably doesn't have an inn or anything like that, but the players can stay. They have a livery stable. They might be able to stay there, a back room at a tavern, but literally they might have to just sleep outside. And of course, player characters are used to camping, so that's not a problem. And you can just make that decision. Again, 1, 2, 3, there's an indoor place to sleep. 4, 5, 6 are risen, right? And that's it. You just do that and say whatever. And if they do indoors, it's 5 copper or whatever. You can look in the book to see how much things should cost. You can look it up online, that kind of thing. And just once you've done it a few times, once you've made these 1-minute villages, you'll know how much things cost. The players will then begin to have a sense, because again, you can argue, well, they grew up in this world, they might have a sense of what a village is and isn't. And that takes into account the whole sort of, do you make them make a perception check to see that something's wrong about this place or not? Well, we in the real world can tell oftentimes, if we know the culture, people are acting shady, weird, there's something going on, as opposed to a totally foreign culture is much more difficult because you just don't know how people act in social situations. And this brings us to the final thing. And this is something I use all the time, but you really do have to be careful. That's if the town has a secret. They have something they're hiding from outsiders, something about this that they don't want the player characters to know collectively. It can be one individual townsperson or whatever, or small. Usually it's going to be a small group that has something. So let's just say that the main family has an artifact they've just recently discovered. They did a hunting expedition in the Barren Hills and they found some magic item. And they haven't told anybody about it. Now, the question there is, do the players, do they represent someone that might want to purchase this? Or do they want to keep it secret? Were they asked to get this if they didn't just find it? Or were they asked to get it by somebody, or have they heard about this item in lore and now suddenly they found the sword of, Kezelrod or something where they know they've got something really valuable? And I think secrets are a great thing. I use them all the time, as I say, but you got to be careful because the players will always then expect, well, what's the secret of this place? Because you can have things like there's a curse on the village. Again, you go to Barovia, right? The Curse of Strahd. There's something going on everywhere, and the townspeople act accordingly, right? They're bummed out or whatever. I haven't played that in a long time, but I believe that's what it is. You can always do the curse. You can always do a dark secret. They murder the original inhabitants of this area. And, ever since then, once a year, they must sacrifice the firstborn in the first day or something. Those kind of things or there's a ghost that haunts them. The other thing that's a beauty of those curse things, if they can hand it off to the players somehow, that's always great. But the other thing about this is, if you're going to do a 1-minute version of this, the secret, you have to have had your secrets made in advance. It's really difficult to improvise something that all holds together, that all makes sense, if you're just sitting there. Literally, they're getting on the ship and they're traveling across, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, okay, this many people, this fortifications, this resource, this sort of thing. To come up with a dark secret that all makes sense, that's tough, which is why it's good to have those in reserve, right? Some ideas. Again, if you're doing this village beforehand, you can spend all the time you want. You can have the personages and who's, two families and all that kind of stuff. Although what you will find is, because I found this, when you go and you make this elaborate village setting, oftentimes in a sandbox campaign, the players never go there. So do you just transplant it to where they do go? You can make that choice. If it's tied to the terrain, the mountain village, well, they're going in the desert, I'll just put it in the desert. You got to change things around. But that's always the risk of that. If you know the players are going to go there, let's say at the end of a session, and for sure they're going to go to a village, then it makes sense to spend that time. But again, this is just improvised. This is just, I got to make this village right now. Okay, here's what it is. And the reason you're doing all this, you're using these techniques, who's in charge, why is it here, how big, all that kind of stuff, is it has verisimilitude. It isn't just you going, okay, you go to this village, what do you can spend the night there. The next day, what do you do, right? You're not letting the players go, well, what's here? Well, I'm going to walk into the town. What do I see? What kind of buildings do I see? What kind of people do I see? What's their attitude? What's going on? Because what will happen in your world is players will recognize that things aren't, first of all, there can be secrets. Not always, not everywhere. It's like the old joke about, I think it was Law and Order, there was a parody of it where every person, the cab driver, the garbage man, whatever, the detectives would run into had a snappy one-liner for them about everything, right? Just to give them a little flash or whatever. Well, it becomes a joke if it happens everywhere. There are people that are just boring, have no interesting thing to say or to do or whatever. It's just a villager. But the point is that they're going to want to look at that after they get used to it. You never know. It pays to investigate. It pays to walk around and ask questions and just see what people are acting like. Because if they're all closed mouth, again, rural people might be suspicious of outsiders. They might not want to talk. They might just go, here's your beer, and not say anything. And so you're real nosy, aren't you? What do you care about what, that kind of thing? And they can get that. But it's cool to have something that, because they'll see that in the connections to the outside world. So in this case, these players were going in to investigate these orcs. They wanted to know. And in fact, I knew that there was this group, so again, another long story, but this evil guy, he was trying to stir up trouble, break the peace treaty between the orcs and the various humanoid settlements. So he was hiring guys to hunt orcs and collect their heads and put them on posts. And so really tick the orcs off and make them attack because he's stirring up trouble for a whole variety of reasons. Well, the people of Hull had seen this. They'd seen these guys come through. They could tell they were like mercenary type bandits, paid their bill and left. And then, near the salt mine, right at the edge of the barren hills, they saw these heads of these orcs and they just ran off because they knew if orcs see this, I don't want to be anywhere near it. And the orcs did find it and collected them. And we're like, what the hell is going on? So they had a little bit of that information. I just threw it in. Those two things. I didn't explain why this happened. They just said there were these guys that came through. They were kind of tough. Oh, and by the way, we found orc heads on stakes. Kurok's tribe, because they recognized his sign. And they knew that's big trouble because the peace treaty is broken. They're on the front lines. So they don't like this at all. So, but the players had to ask. They didn't just go, hey, by the way, there's these orcs, heads on sticks. No, the players had to go and say, what's going on? Have you heard anything, whatever, and befriend them and spend some money. That always gets, lubricates the gears of people talking, right? And they found that information. So I did that in literally the 1 minute between them saying, it might have been because they had to be on the ship. And I sort of said, oh, was there a random, ships are a random encounter? Oh, the dragon turtle surfaces, that kind of thing. But there wasn't any. And they landed and we moved on. And it looked as though the village of Hull had been part of my world since I first thought it up and, was integrated and it all made sense. So hopefully that's helpful to you. If you run into that situation where you got to create a village in 1 minute, use those techniques that I've talked about. And I think you'll be able to make something that your players, it'll connect to your world. It'll give them information. It'll say something about the way people live in your world. And that means that everyone has fun. And if you like what you've seen, please subscribe. Always looking for more. Leave some comments. I'd love to hear about your improvisational techniques or situations you've run into where you had to make something up on the fly. Most importantly, though, keep playing an RPG game, whichever one you choose. Tell somebody else about it.